Have you ever been misunderstood? Or maybe misrepresented? Have you ever had someone think they know who you are, only to finally meet you and say, "Oh, you're not at all like I thought you were"? We've all, at different times, been labeled. We've all had things assumed about us that aren't true. And the truth is, we do this with God too. Millions of us go through life and we think we know all about God. We've heard of Jesus. We've heard of the Ten Commandments. We know most of the rules. But do we know who He truly is? Do we know what He's really like?
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to church. So glad you're here today. It is a beautiful spring day, but you are here. I'm so excited that you are here. I'm honored you take time this weekend to be here. If we haven't met, my name is Jason. and I'm one of the pastors here. And you're coming in, if you're first time here, if you're coming in at the end of a 4-part series that we've been doing called 4 Things I Wish You Knew About God. This is all about who God is, not according to us, but according to Himself. And I love that you're here. We've been saying this for weeks. Sundays are our favorite day of the week. We say it like this: it's the best day of the week, and it's even better when you're here, so thank you for being with us. I'm excited about this series that we've been in. I'm excited to wrap it up because it's been really helpful and fun, but I want to invite you back next week. Next week, we're kicking off a series that I believe is going to be super helpful. For 4 weeks, we're going to do a series called Overwhelmed, and I don't know about you, but there's just some days and some seasons in my life where stress and anxiety and worry tend to rule the day, and if you struggle with any of those things, you are not alone. In fact, there are hundreds and hundreds of us that deal with that all the time. And so we want to talk about how can we get over being overwhelmed. And so it's going to be a really great series. And so be here next week. Do me a favor and bring somebody with you, because it's going to be awesome as we kick that off together. Well, today I want to go in and conclude our series called 4 Things I Wish You Knew About God. And today's the hardest one. In fact, if you're new, please come back next week. Today is the hardest one. Honestly, today is going to go down in history as the single weirdest verse I've ever preached from in my whole life. And so best of luck to you and to me, and it's going to be good. And so let me catch you up on where we've been so you don't feel lost if you've missed any of the weeks. On week 1, we started with this really important question. We said this: what do you think about God, and what do you think He thinks about you? What do you think about God, and what do you think He thinks about you? Now, this is such an important question because what we think about God ultimately kind of pulls our souls in that direction. I would say it to you like this: the picture you have of God, no matter if you created it or if you've allowed God to speak for Himself, what you think of God really is, it affects every part of your life. And so week 1, we said this. In Exodus chapter 33, there's this fascinating story where Moses, who lives this extraordinary life, I mean, he parted the Red Sea, God gave him the 10 Commandments, but in Exodus 33, he's having this conversation with God, and he goes, "God, I just want to see you. Show me who you are. Let me experience you." And God says to him, "Cool, but if you saw me, you would literally fall over dead." And Moses is like, "All right, what's plan B?" And God says, "I'll show you a part of me and I'll reveal my name to you." And so week 1, we said God has a name. It's the name Yahweh. And this name Yahweh is so important because it means God's close. He's closer than our next breath. I mean, He's near and He cares. That's the picture God paints of Himself. Then week 2, we said that as God described Himself in Exodus 34, He describes Himself as compassionate. So week 2, we said God is compassionate. Last week, week 3, we said God is faithful. And the words we used last week, it says that He's abounding in love and faithfulness. Love is the Hebrew word hesed, and faithfulness is the Hebrew word emet. It means unconditional love forever. He's faithful to who He says He is. And then the verses end kind of strange. In fact, let's read the verses together. Exodus 34, verses 6. It says, "And He, being God, passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, and this is the Hebrew word for the name of God, Yahweh, the Lord your God, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God." We're cool with that, right? He's compassionate. That's good. He's slow to anger. I could use some of that, especially from God. Abounding in love and faithfulness. All of this sounds good. It even keeps going and it keeps being good. Maintaining love to thousands. We're going to come back to this today. And forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. I'm good with all of those things. I want to serve a God who's abounding in love and faithfulness, who's compassionate and slow to anger. I want to love a God who's maintaining love to me and to thousands, and who is a forgiving God. Who doesn't want that? And then it gets super weird. Yet, He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Now, quick group confession time. How many of you have struggled with this last verse as we've read it every single week? Some of you are biblical theologians. I've struggled with it every single week because it's super weird. And I've got good news and bad news about it, okay? The good news is it doesn't mean exactly what you might think it means as you read it in a cursory level. There's more happening here. The bad news is the Bible speaks for itself. Like, we don't get to recreate God in our own image. So many of us, what we do is we tend to think God is exactly like we are. And so what that does is it reduces God to just a figment of our imagination. What I mean by that is if we're conservative, we think God is conservative. If you're liberal, you think God is liberal. If you think God is if you're Republican, you may think God is Republican. If you're a Democrat, you may think he's a Democrat. You may think God's a guy. You may think God's a girl. Whatever you think when you think of God, we tend to create God as a figment of our imagination and not actually who he is, but God's word speaks for itself. And if we're going to be Christians and actually follow Jesus, we can't take out the parts of the Bible that are uncomfortable to us, but instead, let's lean in, let's dig in, and let's ask, what is God actually saying to us? Now, here's what I want to do. In verse 7, there's 4 phrases that really jump off the page at me, and I want to break each of the phrases down, and all of it should point us to Jesus. So let's see what it says, and let's see what Jesus would have for all of us. The first phrase in verse 7 says that God is maintaining love to thousands. Now, the reason I put of generations here is depending on the translation of the Bible you read, it may say maintaining love to thousands of generations. The NIV translation, which is what we usually preach for, leaves it out, but it's important, and we're going to come back to it. Now, this is important. Just if we leave it out, the phrase is still important in and of itself. The word love is this beautiful word that we talked about last week. In Hebrew, it is the word hesed. Literally, hesed means unconditional, beautiful, indescribable, unbelievable to imagine. It's that kind of love. It's hard to get our minds around. It's this beautiful kind of love. But beyond that, it says that God is maintaining that love to thousands. He's maintaining it. He's not letting it go. He's maintaining it. This word maintaining in Hebrew is the word nasir. Nasir literally translated means to guard or to stand watch over. And what God is saying here is this, is I'm going to love you with everything I am, unconditionally, with no strings attached. I'm going to love you, and I'm going to guard that love. I'm going to nasir, I'm going to maintain, I'm going to watch over that love. It's so important that you understand that you have my love, you have all of me forever. In the book of Psalm, David says it like this, Psalm 40, he says, do not withhold your mercy. This is the same word in Hebrew as compassion from me, Lord, the name Yahweh. May your love, your hesed, and your faithfulness, we said this last week, your emet, always, what? Always protect me. May it maintain. May it stand watch over. May your love always guard me. This is the picture that he paints of love. Now, we understand that God is a God of love. God is love, right? And we understand that he wants to guard over that love, and that feels good. Doesn't that feel okay? And it's really easy for us to lean into the loving parts of God, but sometimes we miss the whole big picture. Quick story for you. When I was about 15 years old, my family spent a week in Fiji. It was my mom and dad and me. And we were in Fiji, and every day we were ministering. But the first day we arrived, we flew into the west coast of Fiji in a city called Nadi. And we had to drive across the island to a city called Suva. And so the group that we were there ministering with, they sent a driver over to pick us up. It was this man, probably about 30 years old, named Betheli. Betheli had this infectious smile, and his laugh was contagious. He laughed like at the end of his laugh. I've never met anyone who laughed like Betheli. And I'll never forget, he picks us up and he starts to drive, and his driving was just strange. It's hard to explain, but he seemed nervous, he seemed tenuous. At times that he should go slow, he went fast. At times he should go fast, he went slow. And as a joke, we said, Betheli, how long have you been driving? He said, 3 weeks, and he was serious about it. And so we're driving through Fiji in the middle of the night. There's no street lights to light the way. At times, he had to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting a random cow or a horse that had wandered out into the street. It was scary. And then, to make it weirder, the lights on the car, like the headlights, started going out. And Betheli goes, oh, don't worry, I know how to fix it. And this is like a 1980s Datsun minivan. He goes, reach under the dashboard, and there's 2 wires that should be touching. Now, I don't know anything about electronics. I don't know about cars. But if wires should be touching and they're not touching, I don't touch wires that should be touching. And he goes, can you just put them together? And so I put them together, and when they touched, the lights came back on, but it shot a little volt of electricity through me. It was weird. And he goes, can you just hold it there? Cool. So I hold it, and it was generally fine until we hit a bump. And whenever we hit a bump, I felt that just shock of electricity go through my body. Well, another hour of drive in the middle of the night, and I'm frustrated. My back is hurting because I had to sit like this to hold the lights together for Bethely's stupid car. And anyways, we get to this point, and my dad goes, oh my goodness, look. And I look up, and we're coming over the peak of a hill looking out, and we can see the Pacific Ocean. We're getting close to Suva. We can see the Pacific Ocean as the sun is beginning to rise. And it is the most beautiful electric picture I've ever seen in my life. No artist, no camera, no film could capture the beauty of this moment. I mean, the sky was littered in shades of neon pink and orange and yellow and red. The sun was so beautiful off of the gleaming Pacific Ocean. I can't even describe it. The funny thing is, I almost missed the big, beautiful moment because I was so consumed by the little moment. I almost missed the big moment because I was so consumed by the little moment. And then this verse, here's what I need you to understand. We just read about the big moment, that God is maintaining love. This is who God is. And we're going to read the weird stuff again in a minute. And that's the stuff that's hard to get our minds around. But I don't want you to miss the big moment because you get so consumed by the little moment. God is maintaining love to thousands or thousands of generations. Then the verse goes on to say he's forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Now, I'm good with this too, because don't you want to serve a God who forgives you? Don't you want to serve a God who's there to forgive anything you do wrong? I sure do. And it says that God is forgiving the trifecta, wickedness, rebellion, and sin. All of these words have different connotations in the Hebrew language. The word wickedness is kind of this junk drawer word. It catches all. It just means wrongdoing. That's what it means. The word rebellion is a legal term that means crime, like to do something wrong or illegal, to break the law. The word sin is not a religious word. Often we think of sin as like not doing what God wants, but sin just means missing the mark or to fail. The closest example would be an archer shooting a bow and arrow, and when the arrow goes through the air, if it doesn't hit the bullseye or hit the target, you failed. You missed the mark. That's what it is. And all of these words, they carry different connotations, but all of these words are connected to us disobeying, dishonoring, not following God's principles. All of these are words connected to sin. And what we read here is God is saying, I'm slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to generations. And then he says this, he says, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. The question I want to ask you is, do you believe that God can forgive all of these things? See, we tend to categorize sins. We tend to say, well, a little white lie that didn't hurt anybody, that's not as bad as murdering someone. And I would kind of agree with you, but also sin is sin. Sin is anything we do that devastates or separates our relationship from God. If God is perfect and holy, then no sin can be a part of this relationship at all. So do you believe that God can forgive the little white lie? He can forgive all of these different levels of sin. Do you believe that God can forgive the murderer? Do you believe this? Well, if you believe it, that God is a forgiving God, it changes everything. Well, look what David said. Psalm 51, his whole life is falling apart. He's just had an affair. He's committed adultery. And not only is that bad enough, but to try to hide his sin, he has the husband of the woman he cheated with put to death. I mean, it's just crazy all that he did. He gets caught, and he turns in Psalm 51 to God, and he says, be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. Forgive me. Go back if you would. Forgive me, he's saying. And your loving kindness, this is that Hebrew word again, according to your hesed, like the way you love me. Please show me the mercy, the compassion that I need because you love me. And he goes on, according to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. This is an outward sin, the thing that I did wrong. And he goes on, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. These words, go back if you want if you will, please. Wash and cleanse are these words that basically mean forgive me, God. I need you to forgive me of my sin. Forgive me of the wrong things that I've done. Here's what you need to know about God. This is important. Next slide for me says this. Forgiveness is not what God does. Forgiveness is who he is. You could say forgiving is the core. It is the nature of God. So often when we approach the Bible, we think of the Bible as like two parts. There's the God of the Old Testament, and then there's the God, Jesus, in the New Testament. And many of us think the God in the Old Testament is this angry killjoy looking to zap us if we do something wrong, and then Jesus comes along, and he's this hippie son who goes off to college, and he gets these new liberal ideas that we should just forgive everybody. The truth is, the word forgive or forgiving is in the Old Testament 682 times before we ever meet Jesus. 682 times. Forgiveness is at the core of who he is. Forgiveness is who God is. When you begin to understand this, it changes your perception about God. So he maintains his love to thousands. He forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And then it goes on to say this, yet, here's the next part of the verse, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Starting to get a little weird for me, right? Doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents. Now, hold up, right? I've had people for weeks now asking me, what does that mean? Does that mean the hard things that I'm going through in my life are because my mom and dad did something wrong? Does it mean that like my great-great-grandparents, I'm trying to think, what is a sin that a great-great-grandparent would do? My great-great-great-grandfather made moonshine and that was illegal. And as a result, is that why I've got these issues and why I've got this sickness and why I'm dealing with these challenges in my life? Well, I need you to understand something, okay? There is a connection, but it's not exactly the way that it seems at a cursory reading. Look what Moses, the same guy who wrote these words in Exodus, says in the book of Deuteronomy. He says this, parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin. Essentially, what Moses is saying is that all of us will be punished accordingly based on our sin. But what we have to understand is there's two entirely different things happening here. The first thing we have to understand is this. We have to understand that sin carries consequences. It just does. Sin carries consequences. And this isn't a God thing. This is just like a normal life thing. Let me explain it to you like this, okay? If you were to leave church today and you were to go out into the parking lot after church and you were to be arrested for selling drugs, first of all, you would have all kinds of issues. Come to church, you'd have drugs in your pocket, right? But if you do this and you go out and you get arrested in the parking lot for selling drugs and you get found guilty and you get put in jail for 15 or 20 years as a result of this sin, right? Does it have ramifications on your children? Of course it does. If you get arrested and thrown into prison for many years, are there punishments, are there consequences that your children will have to face? Of course. For a season, their mom or their dad won't be home. For a season, they'll be raised in a single-parent home. For a season, they won't feel the love and warmth and security that you provide. There's a natural cause and effect here. When you do something wrong, when you sin, there is a ramification and there is an issue for the next generation. Okay, but beyond that, let's take it a step farther. Well, what about divorce? Okay, now this is personal for some of us, and I'm not trying to step all up in your business. But divorce, on some level or another, always happens as a result of there being some sort of sin, even if it's just on one side. Divorce only happens in the context of sin. Does divorce have consequences to your children? Well, it does, but before you answer, I would like to just kind of speak on behalf of those people who were under 30, where 60% of people under the age of 30 grew up in some sort of a broken or blended home because of divorce. Does it have ramifications? Of course it does. Maybe you've walked through it. I know that I've sat in my desk across from hundreds of people over the years, many of them saying, man, it all started when I was a kid. It all started when my parents separated. Does the sin leave a devastation? Does it leave a trail of brokenness for the children? Of course it does. Of course it does. But what it doesn't mean is that because of sin, generation after generation after generation are going to be punished for the sin of a parent. Here's what it does mean. It's that you will be punished for your own sins. Let me say it to you like this. I believe that God's forgiveness, we just talked about God's forgiveness. God's forgiveness is available to all. But there are some people who will never accept and receive that gift of forgiveness, that they just won't. They will always keep God at arm's length and they don't want it. God will have to punish and deal with that. But beyond that, here's what it means in this context. If we go back to the old days, like the ancient times of Israel, if your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was into idol worship, God would deal with that person for not following him. There would be punishment appropriate for the crime, for the sin, right? But if you were 5 generations down from that person and you also worshiped idols, you would also receive the same sort of punishment, the consequences from God. If you didn't, you wouldn't. That's what Moses is saying in the book of Deuteronomy. So now that we understand that, let's take it one step farther, and this is where it gets super weird. Like, that's weird enough. It gets even weirder. Here's what he says. To the 3rd and 4th generation. Now this has irrationally bugged me. For weeks, every time I've read that, I felt this like punch in my stomach of like, oh, I've got to have to try to somehow explain what that means. Do you remember earlier in the verses, we said this, the beginning of verse 7, is that God is maintaining love to thousands, and then I put in parentheses of generations, remember that? And now at the end of this verse, it says that God is willing to deal with and punish and do whatever he has to do to the 3rd and 4th generation. Now, before I explain this, you need to understand what's happening in Hebrew. In the Hebrew language, this is poetic. In the Hebrew language, the word generations doesn't actually even appear at the end of the sentence we just read. It's put there to help make it make sense in English, but in its literal translation, the word generation doesn't even fit. It doesn't even belong there. What we know is this. It is used there in English as a describing word, and what probably should happen, and this happens in some translations of the Bible, is that the first line, maintaining love to thousands, should either include it, of generations, and it should be included at the end, or neither one should include it. The generations line should either be included in the top and the bottom, or not at all. Here's why it matters. It helps us to understand and frame how God weighs out mercy and justice. Look what Moses experiences here in the book of Exodus chapter 20. God says, I, the Lord your God, I'm a jealous God, punishing the children, there's that phrase again, punishing the children of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, it goes on, but showing love to 1,000 generations, it's balanced and symmetrical, for those who love me and keep my commandments. God is saying, I'm going to show love, I'm going to show mercy for anyone who wants it and chooses to receive it, but those who reject me, they're going to experience that devastation. Now, if we stopped here, prayed, and sent you home, this is a super weird message. Here's the point. If there were some sort of a scale, if God had some sort of a scale to show off what happens in his economy, it might look like this. On one side, you have justice, and you need to understand God is just. The fact that God is just, it actually is a good thing. You see, all God really wants and all he's caring about is God would love to see a world where there was no more sin. A world where there was no more shame, a world where there was no more devastation, a world where it wouldn't have to be news that North and South Korea's leaders met this week, like because there would be peace. Like that's what God's hope and that's God's intention, is a world rid of sin, right? So God is just and that is a good thing, but God is also full of mercy. Now, if we take the verses we just read and we keep them symmetrical, which means that God, he maintains his love to thousands of generations, and he has to punish 3rd and 4th generations, here's what it would look like. What God is saying is this, is yes, I am just, and yes, I have to punish those who want to stiff arm me and keep me away and who do not want to receive my forgiveness. But on the justice scale, that would be like 3 or 4 generations. But on the mercy scale, I maintain love to thousands, with plural, of generations. So in God's economy, there would be 3 or 4 on the justice side compared to thousands and thousands and thousands on the mercy side. What it means is this, is that the scale in God's economy would disproportionately turn towards mercy. The scale in God's economy would be freighted, not towards his justice, but instead it would be freighted towards his mercy. Why? Because he's a loving and forgiving God. Let me say it to you like this. Forgiveness is not something God does. Forgiveness is who God is. And if you read these verses and what you read is God is full of judgment. He's going to judge us and he's full of justice. It's like missing the big, beautiful sunset because you're so focused on the stupid wires that keep charging you, that keep shocking you. Instead, what you need to understand is this, is that when it comes to God, yes, there is a sense that God does have to punish certain people and certain generations of people because he's just, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands that he shows mercy because they're open to receiving his forgiveness. The scales are disproportionately tilted towards his mercy. Now, all of this, in my opinion, really what it does is it leads us to Jesus. All of this leads us to Jesus. In the book of Matthew chapter 18, Jesus has this encounter with Peter. Peter is this kind of flighty guy. And Peter comes to Jesus with a question. And honestly, the question is rooted in the idea of who God is from Exodus 34. Here's Peter's words. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive if God is a big forgiving God, if God's scales are tilted and slanted and freighted towards mercy? If God forgives, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Then he says this, how about 7 times? Up to 7? In that day and in that age, the Pharisees and the religious leaders, they said you should forgive at least 3 times. And Peter's like, what if I double it and add 1 for good measure? Like, what about 7? 7 is the ancient number of completion. God completed the world in 7 days. Like, 7 is this beautiful number. Should I forgive 7 times? And look how Jesus responds. Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, no, but 77 times. It's way more. It's exponentially more. Now, if you're here and you're like in conflict with your boyfriend, girlfriend, or your spouse, this isn't like the magical number. You're like 75. Come on, 2 more, then I can really give it to her. That's not what this means, okay? It just means exponentially more. You should forgive exponentially more than what is ever expected or wanted of you. And then he goes on to explain why. He tells us a story. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Time out here for 1 second, okay? In this context, a bag of gold would be the equivalent of 20 years of salary. Okay, now try to do the math in your head. 20 years of whatever your salary you make, whether that's 20,000 or 300,000 or whatever salary, whatever your salary is, times 10,000. Okay, this is an astronomical, mind-boggling, this is billions, maybe even close to 1 trillion. This is a massive number that no person could ever singly repay. And he says this, imagine this happens and you owed 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. It goes on to say this, since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and children, that they all had to be sold to repay the debt. So now you can't pay the debt, I'm sorry, I'm going to make you a slave. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me. Pay attention to this. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. There is no way he could even begin to pay it back. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. Oh, okay, he owes this huge debt, and the master just lets him off the hook. You are completely forgiven of it. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Quick time out. Silver coin was about the equivalent of 1 day's worth of earnings. So figure out what you earned. $50, $100, $200 for a day of work. Whatever that is, this person owed the guy 100 times. It's like 3 or 4 months of wages. Now that's a huge amount. I would hate to owe someone 3 or 4 months of wages, but over time I could absolutely pay that back. He owed an astronomical number. This guy owes a big number, but it's small in comparison. And look how he responds. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. It goes on to say this. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged, notice the same line, be patient with me. Same thing that he had said previously, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. It goes on. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged, and they went to their master and told him everything that had happened. And the master called the servant, you wicked servant, he said, I canceled all of that debt of yours, all the 10,000 times 20 years of salary debt. I canceled all of that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. This, it says, is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Essentially, what Jesus is saying is this. The nature of who God is God is a forgiver. The core of who he is, God, forgiveness flows from him because he's a forgiver. Like that's the nature of who God is. And Jesus paints this picture of a scale where you and I, we owe so much. In the story, you can just kind of assume that God is the master and he forgives us of all of our debt, a debt that we would never be able to repay. But when Jesus died on the cross, he paid a debt that you and I could never pay short of giving our life for it. And the response should be that we take the forgiveness we've been given and we give it out to the world around us who desperately needs it. When you look back at Exodus 34, And when you see it paralleled in the life of Jesus, in my opinion, it points out several unbelievably important things. The first thing is this: God is compassionate. Therefore, we must show compassion. God is slow to anger. We must be slow to anger. God is faithful. Therefore, we must be faithful. God is love. Therefore, we must love. God is forgiving. Therefore, we must be forgiven. And here's the point: forgiven people forgive people. Forgiven people, they forgive people, and forgiven people are free people. Forgiven people are free. Now, when you take all of this and put it in one big pot and stir it around and ask what comes out of it, here's what comes out of it: who God is. Not who we interpret who he is, but who he says he is. At the core of who he is God is near. He's Yahweh, and he has a name. He's a personal, close God to us. He is compassionate, which means he cares. He's slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness. He maintains that love to thousands of generations. He guards over that love so you will know for the rest of your life, for the rest of every generation that is to come, that he is guarding that love because he loves you so much. And yes, he does forgive. He forgives all sorts of wickedness, all sorts of rebellion, and all kinds of sin. There is no sin that he is above forgiving. He'll forgive any and all of it. But he does have to judge because he's just. Because he is just, there has to be fairness. We can't let everyone off the hook in this way. He has to be just. But when you look at the scale in God's economy, it is freighted towards mercy. Why? Because he's a loving, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, forgiving kind of God. And if you've received that forgiveness, if you've experienced that freedom that comes from that forgiveness, what is the response? You should be the most forgiving, loving, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness kind of person. I'm going to ask you all across this room now to bow your head and to close your eyes. And just for this moment, I'm going to ask you to check your own heart and ask the question, am I those things? If God is all of those things, am I any of that? And if you're not, here's your moment to ask God to begin to do a work in you so that you can become more like him. Father, we turn to you, and we thank you that you are everything you said that you are. You're close, you're near, you're personal, you're Yahweh. You're compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. You maintain that love. You stand guard over, you watch over that love. You forgive every kind of sin, every wickedness, rebellion, every sin. You forgive all of it. And thank you, God, that you're just. Thank you, God, that you care. And God, I thank you that you have forgiven us. So God, in the same way from the story we just read about Jesus, that we have been forgiven an insurmountable, unrepayable debt. God, as a result of that, may we take the character and nature of God, that forgiveness that we've received, and may we turn it back to the world around us who so desperately longs for it and needs it. Thank you for that, God.